Minnesota North Woods, October 1888. The air held the clean, sharp edge of impending winter, a promise of the brutal cold that would soon lock the land in a grip of iron. In the small settlement of Tamarack Creek, men were laying in their final cords of wood, chinking the gaps in their cabins with a grim sense of urgency, all except Peter Solheim. He was engaged in an activity that brought work to a standstill among his neighbors. They watched him from a distance, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. Peter, a quiet Norwegian, with the broad shoulders of a man used to heavy timbers, was not splitting wood. He was meticulously, almost reverently, arranging pieces of broken metal inside the firebox of a new masonry structure he had built in the center of his cabin. It wasn't a proper fireplace, nor was it a stove. It was a squat, dense block of fieldstone and clay mortar, oddly small and utterly alien to the frontier. Inside it, he placed the metal, a cracked gear from the sawmill, 2 heavy sash weights from a torn-down government building, a fractured plowshare, and the jagged remains of an old cook stove lid. In total, it was perhaps 40 pounds of useless scrap iron. Cassius Waite, the settlement's most respected builder, a man who had put up 27 cabins across the territory, stood with his arms crossed, a wad of tobacco working in his jaw. He spat a brown stream of juice onto the frosted ground. "That man's gone mad," he said to Roscoe Fenn, the timber merchant who stood beside him. "He thinks he can heat his cabin with garbage. I told him that firebox is half the size it needs to be. He'll get no draw, and what little heat he makes will get swallowed by that pile of rock." Fenn nodded, calculating his future profits. "He'll be begging for green pine from me by Christmas, mark my words. It's a fool's errand." The words spread through the settlement, carried on the crisp autumn air. Peter Solheim, the strange Norwegian, was building a scrap iron furnace. It was called, with casual cruelty, Peter's Folly. What did this quiet Norwegian shipwright understand about thermal mass and heat transfer that the most experienced builders on the Minnesota frontier had completely missed? If you want to understand the simple physics that can make a home warmer with far less fuel, and how old-world wisdom often contains forgotten science, then hit that subscribe button. I promise, the principle Peter Solheim rediscovered is as relevant today as it was in 1888. It's a lesson written in stone, iron, and the hard-won comfort of a family that survived. And do us a favor, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. It's incredible to see where these old stories find a new home. Peter Solheim was no fool. He was a man shaped by a different kind of cold. He had been a shipwright in Bergen, Norway, a city where the cold was a damp, penetrating thing that came off the North Sea and settled deep in your bones. In that world, you didn't just fight the cold, you had to outsmart it. Building a seaworthy vessel taught a man that every joint had to be perfect, every piece of timber chosen not just for strength, but for its reaction to moisture and temperature. Waste was not an option. A ship that wasted space was inefficient. A ship that wasted energy was a death trap. Peter brought this meticulous, unforgiving discipline with him to the vast, timber-rich lands of Minnesota. He had arrived with his wife, Ragnhild, and their 2 small children, Torbjörn and Sigrid, drawn by the promise of 160 acres of land to call his own. The land was good, but the first winter, that of 1887, was a brutal, soul-crushing education. Their cabin, built to the exact specifications lauded by men like Cassius Waite, became a cage of cold. It was a standard log structure, tight by local standards, heated by a brand-new, top-of-the-line cast-iron stove they had spent a third of their savings on. The stove failed them, not mechanically, but fundamentally. It was a tyrant, demanding constant tribute. Peter felt like he spent his entire existence feeding it split oak. It roared with heat, its metal sides glowing a dull, menacing red. Standing within 3 feet of it, you would sweat. 10 feet away, you shivered. The air it produced was scorching and dry, cracking their skin and making the children cough through the night. But the heat was an illusion. It rose, stratifying at the ceiling, leaving the floor a frozen plain. More than once, Ragnhild found a skin of ice in the water bucket, a mere 6 feet from the stove that was consuming Pater's life's work. They slept in coats and hats. The children burrowed under a mountain of wool blankets and animal hides. Pater would wake in the deep night to the sound of the wind knifing through infinitesimal cracks in the chinking, and the silence from the stove. The silence that meant the fire was dead and the cold was flooding back in. He felt a profound personal failure. He was a builder, a master of wood and structure, yet he could not provide the most basic of needs for his family, a warm, safe home. That winter, he swore he would not let his wife and children endure another siege like it. He remembered the old country, the tales of the kakaloven, the massive tile stoves that warmed farmhouses with just a few logs a day. He didn't have the tile or the expertise, but he understood the principle. It wasn't about making a bigger fire. It was about capturing every last bit of heat the fire produced. The fundamental flaw, Pater realized, was in the American obsession with the cast iron stove. It was a miracle of the industrial age, portable, relatively cheap, and capable of generating immense heat quickly, but it was a profound failure of thermal engineering. The stove was a convective heater. Its primary function was to heat air. Hot air, being less dense, immediately rises. In a typical frontier cabin, this created a useless reservoir of 100-degree air trapped against the ceiling, while the floor, where his children played and slept, remained at a bone-chilling 35 degrees. Cassius Waite's own cabin, a model of local construction, had a 40-degree temperature differential between a man's head and his feet. It was an absurdly inefficient system. Furthermore, the stove was a heat pump for cold. The roaring fire needed a constant supply of oxygen, which it drew from inside the cabin. This created negative pressure, sucking in frigid outside air through every crack, every seam, every gap in the floorboards. The very act of heating the cabin made it draftier. The faster you burned your wood, the more cold air you pulled in to fight. It was a self-defeating cycle. And then there was the waste. Pater, watching the thick plume of smoke rising from his chimney, knew he was looking at his own squandered labor. That smoke and hot gas contained more than 60% of the energy released by the burning wood. Flue gas temperatures in a standard stovepipe could exceed 700 degrees Fahrenheit. This was pure, high-grade heat being vented directly into the Minnesota winter. It was like trying to fill a bucket that had a massive hole in the bottom. The stove had almost zero thermal mass. Its thin cast iron walls, while excellent at transferring heat quickly, were just as excellent at losing it. The moment the fire died down, the stove became a cold lump of iron, radiating cold as effectively as it had just radiated heat. The entire system was designed for flash, not for substance. It heated the air, not the occupants, and it wasted the majority of the fuel in the process. This, Pater knew, was the true enemy. Not the cold, but the waste. His plan was simple in concept, but radical in practice. He would build a device to capture that wasted heat. He started in late summer, gathering field stones from his newly cleared acreage. He chose them carefully for size and shape, hauling hundreds of pounds on a stone boat. He mixed his own mortar from local clay, sand, and straw, a durable, heat-resistant blend he'd learned from old masons in Norway. He laid the foundation and began to build, not a wide, open fireplace, but a compact, dense core of masonry. The first departure from local custom was the firebox. It was small, only 18 inches wide and 24 inches deep, lined with the best fire clay he could find. Cassius Waite had scoffed openly. "You'll never fit a proper log in there, Solheim. You'll be splitting kindling all day." Pater had simply replied, "The fire should be hot, not large." The true innovation was invisible from the outside. Instead of a straight path for the smoke to exit, Pater constructed a serpentine flue. The hot gases from the fire would be forced to travel down one side of the masonry mass, across the bottom, and up the other side before they could escape through the chimney pipe that exited through the roof. This path was nearly 15 feet long, all contained within an 800-pound block of stone and mortar. The goal was to give the hot gases the maximum possible time to transfer their heat into the masonry. But stone, he knew, had a weakness. It was excellent at storing heat. It had a high specific heat capacity, but it absorbed that heat very slowly. Its thermal conductivity was low. A blast of 1,200-degree gas from a fire would rush past the stone, transferring only a fraction of its energy. He needed a bridge, something that could soak up the intense initial burst of heat with incredible speed and then bleed it into the surrounding stone more slowly. He had no soapstone, the material of choice for the expensive European heaters. He had no money for custom-forged iron plates, but he had access to the settlement's junk pile. This was the reason for his strange collection of scrap. Iron's thermal conductivity is nearly 50 times that of granite. It acts like a sponge for heat. He carefully embedded his 40 pounds of scrap iron, the plowshare, the gears, the sash weights, directly into the path of the flue gases, just above the firebox where the heat was most intense. He packed his clay mortar tightly around each piece, creating a composite core of high-conductivity metal and high-capacity stone. Waite visited again during this phase, his curiosity warring with his disdain. "Solheim, that's the damnedest thing I've ever seen. That iron is going to expand twice as fast as your stone. It'll crack your whole contraption to pieces the first time you get a real fire going." "It has room to move," Pater said, pointing to the small gaps he'd left, packed with a sandier, more forgiving mortar mix. He didn't explain the physics of differential expansion coefficients. He just returned to his work. His wife, Ragnhild, watched with a worried crease in her brow. The structure dominated their small cabin. "It looks solid, Pater," she said one evening, placing a hand on the cool stone. "But will it be warm enough for Sigrid? The old stove, it was hot." "This will be a different kind of warm," he promised her. "A quiet warm." He finished the exterior with a smooth plaster of fine clay, giving it a clean, simple look. It was done. It wasn't a fireplace. It wasn't a stove. It was a heat battery. To understand the genius of what Pater Solheim had built, you have to understand the three ways heat moves: conduction, convection, and radiation. The conventional cast iron stove was a master of one, convection, and a practitioner of another, radiation. Pater's device was engineered to master all three in a sequence designed for maximum efficiency. The problem with the old stove wasn't the fire. A well-stoked fire is an incredibly efficient chemical reaction, releasing thousands of British thermal units, or BTUs, of energy. The problem was the waste. Pater's design was, at its heart, a waste heat recovery system. When he lit a fire in the small firebox, he used small, dry logs. This created a fast, intensely hot fire. More like a furnace than a hearth. The temperatures inside the firebox would quickly reach over 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit. The first stage of heat transfer was immediate. The fire radiated intense infrared energy, which was absorbed by the interior walls of the firebox. But the real work began with the flue gases. In a normal stove, these superheated gases, a mix of smoke, carbon dioxide, and water vapor, would rush up a 6-inch stovepipe and be lost to the sky. In Pater's heater, they couldn't. Their path was blocked and diverted. They slammed first into the 40 pounds of embedded scrap iron. This was the critical step. The iron, with its incredibly high thermal conductivity, acted like a heat exchanger in a modern engine. It absorbed the thermal energy from the gases with shocking speed. The molecules in the iron vibrated violently, its temperature soaring. This was conduction in its most powerful form. The iron pulled thousands of BTUs out of the exhaust stream in a matter of minutes. That heat, which would have been wasted, was now captured. The captured heat then began its second journey. The hot iron, now a reservoir of energy, started conducting its heat outward into the 800-pound mass of cooler fieldstone and clay mortar that surrounded it. This was a much slower process, governed by the lower thermal conductivity of the stone. The iron was the sprinter. The stone was the marathon runner. The iron captured the heat quickly. The stone stored it and released it slowly. As the hot gases continued their journey through the 15-foot serpentine flue, they cooled progressively. They gave up more and more of their heat to the masonry walls through convection and conduction. By the time the gases finally exited the chimney pipe, their temperature was no longer 700 degrees. It was closer to 250 degrees, hot enough to prevent creosote buildup, but cool enough to prove that the vast majority of the fire's energy had been successfully transferred into the mass of the heater. After an hour or two of this intense burning, Pater would shut the flue damper, starving the fire of oxygen. The coals would die out. The fire was over. But the work of the heater was just beginning. The entire 840-pound mass was now charged with heat. Its surface temperature would stabilize at around 140 to 150 degrees Fahrenheit. Now the third and most important form of heat transfer took over: radiation. The heater began to radiate gentle, long-wave infrared heat in all directions. This type of heat doesn't primarily warm the air. It travels through the air until it strikes a solid object, the floor, the walls, the furniture, the people, and warms them directly. It was the same kind of warmth you feel from the sun on a cool day. It was a deep, pervasive warmth that eliminated cold spots and created a uniform, comfortable environment from floor to ceiling. Pater had turned a violent, short-lived fire into a gentle, all-day source of radiant comfort. He had turned 40 pounds of scrap iron into the heart of a thermal battery. That December, the winter came not as a guest, but as an invading army. A blue norther swept down from Canada, a solid wall of Arctic air that plunged the thermometer to 22 degrees below zero and held it there for 6 days. The wind was a living thing, howling around the corners of the cabins, driving fine, sharp snow into every microscopic crevice. For the settlers of Tamarack Creek, it was the ultimate test. At the cabin of Cassius Waite, the air was a battleground. His magnificent cast-iron stove, the largest in the settlement, roared day and night. The stovepipe glowed a faint cherry red in the gloom. His wife and children huddled near it, wrapped in blankets, their faces flushed from the intense, dry heat, while their backs remained cold. The floor was an ice rink. A cup of water left near the wall froze solid in under an hour. They were burning through their seasoned oak at a terrifying rate. A quarter of a cord in just those 6 days. Waite knew that at this pace, his woodpile wouldn't last through February. He started eyeing the unfinished pine furniture his wife cherished. The story was the same across the settlement. Luella Pratt, the school teacher, was forced to dismiss her classes. The small schoolhouse, heated by a standard potbelly stove, was simply untenable. She couldn't get the indoor temperature above 40 degrees, and the ink in the inkwells was freezing. Families with young children were in quiet crisis. The constant, inefficient burning filled the cold, still air of the valley with a perpetual haze of wood smoke. But at the Solheim cabin, there was a strange, almost miraculous peace. The contrast was absolute. Peter would rise in the dark, cold cabin, the heater having finally radiated away most of its stored energy overnight. He would load the small firebox with a precise amount of dry wood and light it. For 2 hours, the fire would burn with a clean, intense roar. Then he would close the damper, and the fire's work was done for the next 12 hours. There was no roaring stove, no scorching bubble of heat. Instead, a gentle, silent warmth radiated from the masonry block. The surface of the heater was a pleasant 140 degrees, warm enough to heat a pot of coffee or dry wet mittens, but not hot enough to burn a child's curious hand. The air temperature in the cabin stabilized at a comfortable, even 68 degrees. There were no drafts because the heater wasn't sucking in vast quantities of air. The windows were free of the thick frost that coated every other pane of glass in the settlement. Most remarkably, the temperature was consistent. Ragnhild could place her dough bowl on the far table to rise. Torbjörn and Sigrid, their coughs from the previous winter gone, could play on the floorboards in their woolen socks and shirt sleeves. The floor was the warmest part of the house. The family had gone from surviving the winter to living in it. They were using less than a third of the wood of their neighbors. Winter stopped being a siege and became simply a season. The breaking point for Cassius Waite came on the 5th day of the deep freeze. His woodpile of seasoned oak was gone, and he was now burning less efficient birch. He knew Peter Solheim had a meticulously stacked and covered woodpile, and swallowing his pride, he pulled on his heaviest coat and walked the 100 yards to the Norwegian's cabin. He was coming to ask for a loan of wood, a humbling act for the settlement's foremost builder. He expected to find the Solheims huddled together under blankets, their foolish rock pile having long since failed them. He knocked, and when Ragnhild opened the door, he was met not by a blast of scorching air but by a wall of calm, uniform warmth. It was a sensation he had never felt before in a cabin in winter. He stepped inside, and his eyes struggled to process the scene. The room was bright and comfortable. The 2 children were on the floor, quietly playing with carved wooden animals. Peter was at the table, mending a harness. No one was wearing a coat. Waite's gaze immediately shot to the masonry heater. The firebox door was closed. There was no flicker of light, no sound of burning wood, no heat shimmering in the air above it. It was silent. "Peter," Waite said, his voice raspy from the cold, "your fire's out." Peter looked up from his work, his expression calm. "I know," he said. "It has been for 6 hours." Waite was speechless. He took off his hat, his mind refusing to connect what he saw with what he knew to be possible. He walked slowly around the single room, holding out his bare hand. The warmth was everywhere, as if emanating from the walls themselves. He couldn't comprehend it. He finally walked over to the heater and placed his palm flat against the smooth clay plaster. It was wonderfully, deeply warm. The heat was real. "How?" he finally managed, turning back to Peter. "My stove is burning half a rick a day, and my floor is still cold enough to freeze water. You are burning nothing, and you are warm." Peter Solheim put down his harness and gave the most complex explanation he had ever offered. "The fire is fast and hot. It gives its heat to the iron. The iron gives its heat to the stone. The stone gives its heat to the house. All day." He pointed to his modest wood box, barely a quarter empty. "It wastes nothing." In that moment, Cassius Waite's 2 decades of frontier building experience became obsolete. He saw the truth, not in an argument or a blueprint, but in the undeniable evidence of 2 children playing happily on a warm floor, while the temperature outside was 22 degrees below zero. He didn't apologize for his mockery. That wasn't the way on the frontier. Apologies were words. Instead, he dealt in facts. The next day, he found Roscoe Fenn struggling to load a sled with frozen logs. "Roscoe," Waite said, his voice clear and firm in the frigid air. "Stop. What Solheim built, it works. It works better than anything I've ever built or seen. I was wrong." That simple admission, coming from Cassius Waite, echoed through the settlement with the force of a felled oak. It was a complete reversal, an acknowledgement of a new truth. The mockery of Peter's folly died instantly, replaced by a quiet, urgent curiosity. That spring, after the thaw, Cassius Waite approached Peter not as a critic, but as an apprentice. He asked Peter to help him rebuild the fireplace in his own cabin. Peter, who held no grudges, agreed. He asked for no money, only for Waite's help in clearing another acre of his land for planting. For a week, the two men, the territory's most respected builder and the quiet Norwegian immigrant, worked side by side. They built a second Solheim heater, this one slightly larger, incorporating a few improvements Peter had conceived of during the long winter. The news of their partnership was all the validation the community needed. Before the first snow of the following winter, 7 more families had torn out their inefficient stoves and fireplaces. Peter's design, now with Waite's enthusiastic endorsement, became the new standard. Peter never supervised directly, but would quietly offer advice when asked, explaining the importance of the serpentine flue or the placement of the iron core. Roscoe Fenn, the timber merchant, noted with a wry smile that his sales of cordwood were down nearly 20%, but he had sold every last piece of scrap iron he owned for 10 times its usual price. The most significant conversion was the schoolhouse. With funds raised by the community, Peter and Waite built a proper heater in the center of the one-room building. That winter, for the first time in its history, the Tamarack Creek School did not close for a single day due to cold. Luella Pratt wrote a letter to the county extension agent, detailing the remarkable efficiency and comfort of the new device. The agent, intrigued, made the 2-day journey to the settlement. He measured temperatures, calculated wood consumption, and interviewed a dozen families. His subsequent article in the Minnesota Farmer's Almanac, titled "The Minnesota Iron Core Heater, A Revolution in Frontier Comfort," spread the idea far beyond the small valley. The principles, if not the exact design, began to take root across the northern territories. It was a quiet revolution, born of scrap iron and quiet confidence. What Peter Solheim had created, using nothing more than intuition, memory, fieldstone, and 40 pounds of junk, was a high-performance thermal storage device. He had, without any formal training in thermodynamics, perfectly anticipated the core principles of modern building science that would not be formally codified for another 70 years. Today, we call these systems masonry heaters or rocket mass heaters. Engineers use complex computational fluid dynamics software to model the flow of hot gases and heat transfer through different materials, but their goal is precisely the same as Peter's: capture the peak energy of a short, hot fire in a dense, conductive core, and then allow that energy to radiate slowly and evenly from a surrounding thermal mass. His use of scrap iron was a stroke of untutored genius. It was a cost-free, readily available substitute for the expensive soapstone or fire brick used in European models. He understood on a practical level the critical difference between heat capacity and thermal conductivity, and he found a way to combine 2 different materials to leverage the best properties of both. Peter's heater was not a primitive solution. It was an extraordinarily advanced piece of engineering, perfectly adapted to its environment and available resources. Modern reconstructions of similar heaters have shown efficiencies of over 85%, compared to the 20 to 30% efficiency of the cast iron stoves they replaced. The frontier was not a place for primitive thinking. It was a laboratory for radical, life-saving innovation. The Minnesota North Woods in 1888 did not reward credentials, tradition, or loud opinions. It was an unforgiving environment that rewarded one thing and one thing only: what worked. The mockery that Peter Solheim endured was not born of malice, but of a genuine confidence in established methods. Cassius Waite and the others were experts in a system of building that had proven itself adequate for survival. Their failure was not one of incompetence, but of imagination. They could not see beyond the limits of their own experience. Peter never wasted a breath arguing with them. He never tried to defend his theory or belittle their knowledge. He simply built. He gathered his stones, placed his scrap iron, and mixed his clay. He trusted the physics he had observed in the old country and the skill in his own hands. And then he let the winter be the judge. His vindication was not a boastful "I told you so." His vindication was the quiet, undeniable comfort of his home. It was the sight of his healthy children playing on a warm floor. It was the request for help from the very man who had mocked him the loudest. That is how real wisdom spreads on the frontier, not through debate or persuasion, but through demonstration, through the quiet, irrefutable evidence of a problem solved. If this story of practical genius and quiet confidence resonated with you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It allows us to continue unearthing these forgotten histories of innovation. In the comments below, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have you ever encountered a piece of old technology that was, in its own way, smarter than its modern equivalent? Join us next time as we travel to the Kentucky mountains of the 1840s to explore how a reclusive farmer used the constant temperature of creek water to create one of the first known geothermal-assisted cooling systems for his spring house, decades ahead of its time. This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events are fictionalized, but the engineering principles described are based on real historical practices of masonry heater construction. Any application of these techniques today should be done in strict accordance with modern building codes, safety standards, and with professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional engineering or legal advice.